Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm wrapping up all the books that I read in June. June was Pride Month and I managed not to read any books that were focused on LGBT people. June was also my birthday month and I managed not to receive a single book for my birthday. I have been told that I'm quite difficult to buy books for, or that people are a little bit intimidated to buy books for me because they're scared that they'll buy me something that I've already read or already own. So I think next year I need to do a little bit of work to combat that line of thought because I love receiving books as gifts, even if I am slowly running out of space for them. Anyway, I'm going to get right into the book reviews because I don't want this video to be a million years long. And the first book I read last month was England Is Mine by Nicholas Padamsee. Padamsee is a British author that was included in the Observer's Best New Novelists list at the start of the year, which is always a good barometer of books to look out for. I loved the sound of this one and was very grateful to receive a finished copy from the publisher Serpent's Tail. And this was my first June read and it got me off to an absolutely corking start because I thought it was a really enjoyable debut. The book is told from two different perspectives. We've got David, who is a slightly weedy kid. He's into alternative music, and in particular he's a huge fan of one artist called Carl Williams, who seems to be a bit of a stand-in for Morrissey. Williams is this vegetarian lefty who gets himself into a bit of hot water when he says that Islam is not compatible with Western society, and he kind of gets cancelled online and doubles down on his position over it. And that puts David in a little bit of a predicament. The other perspective is another boy at his school called Hassan, who is Muslim but finds himself growing apart from his friends because they drift into a bit of trouble, into drink and drugs, and there's an inciting event at the start of the novel where they beat up and urinate on David. This incident sets our two characters off in very different directions. David becomes a lot more insular, falling into online forums, and he's playing endless hours of Call of Duty as part of a gamer clan, while Hassan further distances himself from his friends and spends increasing amounts of time at his local Muslim community centre. He's also playing video games actually, but he's playing in FIFA tournaments. And if you're not familiar with FIFA, it's a football video game, or if you're American, it's a soccer game. I like to think these differing choices of game are not a commentary on game genres themselves, like shooting games are bad and sports games are healthy, because I think studies have long debunked the idea that violent games create violent kids. Instead, I think it's more about the context, like the community aspect of Hassan playing in person, connecting with people near him, versus David, who's connecting with people far away from him and exposing him to radical ideas outside of the context of his community. There was one thing that was very personally surprising for me, and that this book is set very close to where I grew up. A lot of the places mentioned to me were really familiar. The archetypes of the people and the language they used were jogging really specific memories for me, which I find always really enjoyable in a book. I didn't know about that before going into this one, so I'd be really interested to know if Padamsee and I are actually from the same area. I really liked the writing, but I wouldn't say it was an especially poetic book. It's one that's quite simply written, and I think to great effect actually, because it becomes very compulsively readable. As I was working through it, I felt a bit like it was as if Nick Hornby or David Nichols had decided to tackle far-right extremism. And I thought it moved at a pretty perfect pace. It's set up such that we feel a lot of sympathy for David at the start. He's being bullied, his parents are divorced, his dad is struggling for money and with his health. And we observe his descent. He's like the schmuck in a horror film that we are desperately urging not to go down into the basement. But as readers, all we can do is helplessly watch as things unfold. I found that really effective. And I really liked how very little of this was cut and dry or particularly black and white. Both characters are second-generation immigrants, and we see how, in the wrong context, they can delude themselves and be drawn into extreme views. The mental gymnastics that David goes through is really interesting and really believable. I thought this was a great debut, and I will be very interested to see what Padamsee does next. Next, I read Breakdown by Cathy Sweeney. Sweeney is an Irish novelist, and as with any Irish book lately, I went in with really high expectations. And you know what? I really enjoyed it. This is about an art teacher who lives with her husband and her children and finds herself stuck in what she sees as a bit of an endless cycle of monotony. And one day she just decides she's had enough, and she drives away, and she drives, and then she walks, and then she keeps on walking until she ends up in a cottage in Wales away from her family. As she's going through her disappearing act, we hear about her life before, the complex relationships with her husband, her love for and her infuriation with her children, her job, her ambitions as an artist, and her failed attempts to make that the centre of her life. All the while she's getting further and further from home, and there's some repeating thing about signs and instructions, and she comes across and reads a lot lot of instructional text in her environment, like adverts telling her to be happy or how to solve a certain problem, or signs directing her where to go or where not to go. I haven't fully unpicked how this threads into the thesis of the story, but it was an interesting touch that had me thinking quite a lot as I was reading. What I really liked about this novel, though, was that I think a lot of authors would have written this in a way that kind of conforms to the hero's journey. She'd start off in her normal life and then she'd break with that due to some inciting incident. She'd go on some emotional journey, and then at the end she would reconcile with her family and return to a slightly altered new normal. But this book doesn't do that at all, and the main character doesn't go back. We catch a glimpse relatively early on of her some months after all of these events, and she's still in Wales. She's still building this new life that she set up for herself. I think that felt quite brave and realistic and different. I found the writing highly entertaining. It's written in the first person, and I think the voice was really strong and funny, lots of amusing observations, and she isn't like overly meek or overly crazed. She's just a woman with very few fucks to give, and I enjoyed how at certain points she is kind of overly confrontational to someone who annoys her. She felt like a really real person to me. If I had to nitpick one very small thing, there was a page where she kept saying suffix when she actually meant prefix. But on the other hand, I learned that the word desuetude means something being in a state of disuse. Swings and roundabouts. So yeah, overall, I liked this quite a lot. I think if you enjoyed Soldier Sailor, you will probably enjoy this one too. I don't think it reaches quite the same heights, but it's a really solid novel. Next up, I read Headshot by Rita Bullwinkel, and this is another debut novel. I read this book partly because I'd considered it a Women's Prize contender this year, and Daunt Books had very kindly sent me a copy when I did my predictions video, but also because Bullwinkel was visiting the UK and to my local bookshop, and so I was really looking forward to hearing her talk about the novel. First off, Rita was such a delight. She was very funny and shared some really great anecdotes. I always love to hear an author talk about their work's origins and its creation, and like the creative process that they go through, and then their reactions to our reactions as readers. I find that all really fascinating. Headshot, though, is what I would call a novel in bouts. The conceit of the book is that each chapter is a fight between two young women, and over the course of the book we see a series of boxing matches between 8 of these young women competing in the Daughters of America Cup, which is a fictional boxing championship taking place in Reno, Nevada. It's a highly physical novel. It's really impressive that it's got this like wide-eyed clarity, and it's got really great choreography. Every page is very thick with tension as the matches move one way and then the other. Sometimes you can tell quite early on who's going to win, and then other times you really can't. Rita herself, when asked did she know who was going to win when she started out writing each fight, said that she didn't know who was going to come out on top, and that kind of emerged in the process of writing. What elevates this novel, though, for me, is the narrative voice. So this is a book told in the omniscient third person, but in a really interesting way. It's both laser focused on the girls, like we're right inside their heads, but it exists in this weirdly shared headspace between them, and it takes an incredibly wide angle across time. In between the jabs and the uppercuts, we see what becomes of each of these girls, where they end up, and how the tournament becomes a footnote in their lives. This playfulness with time had me on the lookout not just for who was going to win this match, but who was going to win at life. For whom was this tournament going to be a life-changing event? And as it happens, it isn't one for any of the girls. The champion narrative ends up quite satisfyingly absent. It's a novel that reveals itself not to care too much about glory, but really about portraiture. Ultimately, this is a book about looking someone in the eyes and punching them in the face, and I would highly recommend sparring with its pages. Next, I read Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshananthan. I read this one as part of finishing off the Women's Prize shortlist. I had 2 books left to go. I'd been really excited about reading this one, but I held off reading it at the long list stage because I kind of expected it to get to the shortlist, and it did, and so I just had this and River East, River West to finish off before the winner's announcement. I finished this literally minutes before the winner was announced, and while I was hoping for Soldier Sailor to win when this was crowned the winner, I was really pleased because it is an absolutely fantastic book. This is about a girl growing up in Sri Lanka, in a northern part of Sri Lanka called Jaffna. She lives there with her mother and father, although more often than not he's working away from the family home. And she also lives with her 4 brothers and lives in close proximity to this very close family friend called Kay, who in some ways is a bit like another brother to her, but he's an attractive, highly intelligent person, and she finds herself quite spellbound by him. The book charts Sashi's growing up through a time when tensions are rising and Sri Lanka goes through a civil war, including a period where Indian forces are stationed in parts of Sri Lanka to peacekeep, but in many ways only add to the problems. The Brotherless Night of the title refers to a night where her eldest brother goes missing, and the novel is punctuated by these events related to her brothers and Kay. There's lots of plot, and I found the pace worked really well for me. We see her experience at school and then at university as she trains to become a doctor. We see her moral dilemmas of being involved or not in the Tamil Tigers movement. The tentpole story beats here were fantastic. One I particularly loved was when all the local Tamil boys were rounded up by the authorities and detained, and then the mothers in the area all joined together to set up this mothers' front that protested and got the boys released. I thought the writing was phenomenal. I was so taken in by the lush descriptions of both the environment and also the history and the emotional impact of what was going on. You feel Sashi's affinity for her hometown, and there are great turns of phrase like wanting to pack the green of the trees in her bag. There's another moment where she is visited by someone who had gone off to join the Tigers, and he looks very gaunt when he approaches the house, but she describes his face as being sharpened like a knife. And that's such clever writing to me because it has very clear physical meaning, like you can picture that, but it also evokes the violence that this character has seen and been a part of. There are moments where the narrator breaks the fourth wall and addresses you directly to emphasize how hard it is to understand how something really was, or the import of something a character says because of the gap in meaning between how it was said in Tamil and how it translates to English. I loved that because it really got under the skin of how these stories are so woven into the fabric of local culture and history, and how it's hard to explain to anyone outside of that. Ultimately, I think this was a really successful effort at portraying simultaneously the way organisations use people as chess pieces and the horrific impact that has. Freedom fighters might be fighting for something we would all agree with: the right to self-determination, respect, equality for those of all ethnicities and faiths, but they can often resort to means that are just as abhorrent as the oppressors they're fighting against. That moral greyness is a really hard line to tread, but Ganeshananthan's towed it brilliantly here, and in that way there was something about this reading experience that for me had a lot of resonance with what's happening in Gaza. I loved this, and I think it's a very worthy winner of the Women's Prize. Right, the next book I read was Boy with a Black Rooster by Stefanie Schulte, translated by Alexandra Roesch. This is a recent book from the Indigo Press, who very generously sent me a copy to read and review. It's a translation from German, and it's a fable-like story set in an unnamed place, and actually in a time period that feels like it could be set in the distant past or the distant future. There are kind of medieval vibes, but it also feels like the events of the novel could be unfolding either during or after some time of societal collapse. I don't know if many people out there have read Arcadia by Ian Pears, but it reminded me of one of the strands of that novel. The central character of this novel, though, is called Martin, and he lives alone with his black rooster that he often keeps tucked into his shirt. The events of the book kick off when a painter turns up to paint a mural at his village's church, but nobody can find the key to let him in. It's quite a slapstick affair at this point, with these three curmudgeonly but useless old men arguing over what to do. But Martin volunteers to go over to the next village to find the priest and get the key, and so he takes the first step on what will be his adventure. The start of the story might trick you into thinking that this is a kind of cozy comedy adventure, and I actually read this because I thought I needed a bit of lightness and fun after reading Brotherless Night, because that's a really heavy book. But as it unfolds, it reveals itself to be deeply weird and very dark. The plot is very episodic, and Martin travels the land and meets lots of different people with different problems. There are children being taken by a dark horseman, there's a family who want one last portrait with their son in, let's just say, kind of curious circumstances, and there's an aging queen that rules over the kingdom. In each situation, Martin uses his smarts to get through things, and in the end it all comes together in quite a satisfying way that all ties back to his personal tragedies and the reason he lives alone, which is another deeply dark story. I enjoyed the writing. It was quite straightforward, but it has some really strange and beautiful imagery at times. One example is when the painter makes a sketch of Martin, but then it gets eaten by some maggots. And the narrator kind of tells this accelerated story of how they turn into these rare butterflies that have tasted art and know the boy. And then by chance, it will turn out years later that specimens of these butterflies are exhibited in the same museum as a portrait of Martin and the rooster. Overall, I really liked this. I felt it was very much like a fairy tale for adults, but it wasn't schmaltzy or sentimental. Martin was a really interesting, complex character, maybe neurodivergent coded, maybe not, I'm not entirely sure. But in any case, seeing the world through his eyes was very fascinating. Definitely worth a read. Next, I finished off River East, River West by Aubrey Lescure. This was the other Women's Prize shortlisted book that I needed to finish to complete the entire shortlist, and I listened to it on audio. I actually started this one quite a long time ago when I was on my flight to Japan, so like right at the start of May, and it was really dark on the plane and it felt quite obnoxious to turn my light on to read a physical book, so I started listening to this instead. While I did enjoy it, I think I got maybe a third of the way through and then set it aside for basically the rest of my trip. So I didn't come back to this until maybe like the start of June. And I'll be honest, I think that's a little bit of a me problem that I think impacted my enjoyment somewhat. This is a dual perspective novel, and our first protagonist is Aube, who's a young woman of high school age who lives in China, and she's half Chinese but has a white American mother and US citizenship. Her story is told in the 2000s. The other main character is Lu Feng, Alva's sort of stepfather who knew his mother many years before, but in the present day of the novel they are now together and they've just surprisingly got married. Lu Feng's perspective starts back in the 60s and moves at a faster pace to catch up with the Alva timeline. The structure of this book felt slightly different to a lot of dual perspective novels, which have a tendency to flip between characters really often, like one chapter each, and that's often to keep you hooked on the story. Here though, you get a decent amount of time with each protagonist, moving between them only at the end of each part, which is made up of a number of chapters. I really liked this because I thought spending more time with each character felt like it added to your understanding of them and tipped the scales a little further from plot and closer to character. The balance worked really well for me. Obviously this is a bit more a risk if you find yourself disliking either of the characters, and to be honest, Alva is quite unlikable, but I enjoyed both quite equally. The novel tackles a huge amount of themes actually. Alva's story is a coming-of-age tale all about identity and belonging. She's very culturally Chinese and she goes to Chinese school and speaks Mandarin, but she's still treated as a Laowai, a foreigner, by her classmates. She also, though, doesn't fit into the world of the wealthy white expats that live in China. Lu Feng's story, on the other hand, is about missed opportunities, or rather opportunities taken from him. His university education that's cut short by the Cultural Revolution, his business failures, his arranged marriage and his son. He's not perfect, but with every setback, he gets back up, he dusts himself off, and he tries again. I found him to be a really compelling and interesting character, and I liked that we start off seeing him from Alva's perspective as kind of this weird man who's married her mum, and then the blanks get filled in. What let this down a little bit for me was that it was just a little bit too long. I think it would have benefited from a little more editing, and I'm not sure it really earned its length. There are some storylines that I think could have been tightened up or cut out. In some ways I just felt like I was reading this for an absolute age, and I guess I kind of was, partly through my own failing of that big gap that I took between starting and finishing it. And don't get me wrong, I did enjoy this, just not quite as much as some of the other books that I read this month. Okay, the penultimate book that I read this month was The Coast Road by Alan Murrin. This is another Irish novel and another debut, and well, it's another bloody brilliant read. This book is set in the 90s, in a time leading up to the Irish referendum on legalising divorce. And the central characters of this novel are three women that, had that change to the constitution come sooner, might have made use of it. They are all living in a time when women are there to be wives and little more. Izzy is an ambitious woman married to a politician and somewhat suffocated by his desire to have a perfect homemaker to suit his perfect political image. She's loud and brash and funny when women are supposed to be quiet and demure and laugh at the men's jokes. Colette is a poet that abandoned her husband and children in search of a new, more creative life, but she's returned to find herself without access to her children. And Dolores is a woman knowingly married to a philanderer, forever tied to him thanks to an accidental pregnancy and pressure from her own family, but determined to put on a brave face. These women are aware of each other, and this is a novel filled to the brim with small-town gossip, but they are not the best of friends, and the novel doesn't try to make them so. It's not a tale of three different personalities bandying together to fight for their rights. That might have been an entertaining story, but this is a much more nuanced take than that. Their worlds collide when Colette moves into a cliff-top cottage owned by Dolores and her husband, and Izzy starts to attend a writing course Colette is running to keep herself afloat financially. One thing leads to another, and there's a very dramatic climax. And I know that sounds quite vague and perhaps like every book ever, but I don't want to ruin it. For me, this was a perfect balance of character and plot. It was perfectly paced, it was extremely moving. There are no simple answers, no simple relationships. And if that sounds interesting to you, I'd love for you to experience it yourself without me explaining what happens. Although, for the record, I am Team Izzy. If I had to criticise the book for anything, it's that it does get awfully close to having a bit of an all men are trash thesis, but I think it lands just shy with that with a few sympathetic male characters. Overall, this was a phenomenal 5-star read for me, probably vying with Brotherless Night as my favourite read of the month. Finally then, I read Orbital by Samantha Harvey. This is a short little novel about 6 astronauts on the International Space Station. It follows them over the course of one day, or rather one Earth day as we would experience it on the ground, because over the course of those 24 hours, the ISS loops the Earth 16 times. In this novel, we hop between the heads of these 6 characters. We share in their wonder at the views of land masses from 250 miles up, their backstories and the things that they're missing at home, the monotony of living in such confined space where up and down lose all meaning. In a funny way though, this novel does a very similar thing to Headshot, because while Headshot is a boxing novel that's not really about boxing, this is a space novel that's not really about space. And both exist in this space somewhere between the minds of its main characters, a kind of collective consciousness, which allows this extremely close view in parallel with an extremely wide perspective. And I think that's a really smart way in. And I say this isn't a novel about space, and I'd stand by that, but there was plenty of scientific detail that was very pleasing to me in particular as a reader. There was stuff about the difficulty of maintaining muscle density in zero gravity, about how orbiting is just continually falling just at the right speed, and about some of the practicalities of needing to strap things down in zero G so that they don't float away, including the astronauts themselves when they go to sleep. But you really don't need to be scientifically minded to read and enjoy this, because it's about art and human connection, how from that high up in the daytime, our mark on the planet is minuscule. The borders we draw are invisible. It's about perspective and beauty. And I think this can be overwhelming to digest, which is quite unexpected when the novel is so short. And Samantha Harvey writes it really beautifully. This is so successful in containing a huge amount in such a small space, which I guess kind of reflects the International Space Station itself. And it's a message I think a lot of us need to reflect on in a time when we're so polarised. I included this book in my book of predictions, and I'd be very happy to see it on the list. It's a really great novel. So those are my reads for the month of June. I read The Boy with the Black Rooster for Savage Prompts, which was to read something with an animal, vegetable or mineral on the cover. And quite shamefully, none of these books aligned with the Reading Shame Forgiveness Month prompt for the Read Good Challenge. I did start Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin for that prompt, but I just didn't finish it quite in time, so that'll be reviewed next month. But I'm still going to tick that off my prompt list. Just a reminder that you don't need to be on time to join in with the challenge. I'd love to hear if you've read any of these books or you're really interested in reading them. Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and if you'd like to see more from me, then hit subscribe. But until next time, toodles!